Morning, all. Oh, good afternoon. What do I say morning?
Hi, Mitch. How are you?
Alive and well, Jim.
Better than having to file your
Despite
taxes
the rumors
today?
to the contrary.
Right. Better than having to file your taxes today.
Hello,
right?
can everyone hear me?
Yes, we
I hear
can.
you well, Nancy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to NYC Builds Bio's first sponsored seminar series with Triumvirate Environmental. Triumvirate Environmental is a world-class environmental health and safety firm focusing on operational solutions for lab space in the life science, healthcare, and university sectors, be it in research, clinical, or manufacturing operations. Triumvirate provides EH&S support, hazardous material management, field and engineering services to achieve safe and compliant lab operations throughout the United States. TEI is sponsoring member of NYC Builds Bio Plus and Lab Central in Cambridge. The webinar is entitled Risk Management in Operating Wet Labs in New York City and Best Practices for Achieving Them. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Nancy Kelly, and I serve on the steering committee and as a founding member of NYC Builds Bio. I would like to acknowledge the founding and corporate members of NYC Builds Bio who make this programming possible. And I'd also like to acknowledge my partner, Mitch Simpler, who is a co-founder and also on the steering committee of NYC Builds Bio. Welcome, Mitch.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I look forward to this webinar today. So without further ado, Nancy.
We're hosting additional online programming next week on April 22nd, our member reception spotlighting Turner Construction. And on May 6th, we will hold an interesting webinar focused on the recent 165,000 square foot lease signed by Mount Sinai with Georgetown in Midtown West. So be sure to check out the website for those and other upcoming events. Before we begin, I just want to cover a few administrative details. There's a program in PowerPoint highlighting the hosts, speakers, and projects for the meeting. These will be posted on the NYC Builds Bio Plus website after the meeting. The program is being recorded and will be available on the website and the NYC Builds Bio Plus YouTube channel after the meeting. If you are having technical difficulties accessing the Zoom room or other issues, please email info@nycbuildsbio.org or send a notice through the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Since most of you are participating in listen-only mode, please feel free to submit your questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will open up for discussion and Q&A at the end of the program and will address as many questions as possible. At the end of the meeting, we will also have a chance for smaller randomized groups to meet in separate rooms where you can open your videos and microphones to talk to each other and to our speakers. You can stay as long as you would like to get to know each other and share stories. But before I open it up to Jim Holland of Triumvirate Environmental, we thought it would be great to give you some information about the developing life science clusters in New York City and beyond. So where exactly is life science growth taking place in the New York City marketplace? Next slide. Just as happened in Cambridge, Massachusetts, over the course of the development of its life science sector, a number of subclusters are developing around academic hubs in Manhattan, flanked by 2 ground-up development opportunities in live, work, play environments for millions of square feet of commercial life science space in Long Island City and Jersey City. Next slide. The East Coast Life Science Corridor, consisting of Mount Sinai, Academic Alley, Long Island City, Midtown East, and Hudson Square, which is the nexus between the east and west sides of Manhattan. Next slide. The West Side Corridor consists of stretches from the Bronx Hutchinson Metro Center down to Columbia Presbyterian in the north and through Manhattanville, Midtown West, Hudson Square, and on to Jersey City. Next slide. So looking at some of the subclusters in particular, we start with on the East Side Corridor with Mount Sinai. This area consists primarily of academic medical institutions in pink and educational institutions in purple, but it's becoming a hub for artificial intelligence, precision wellness, and robotics. Next slide. Then we go down to Academic Alley. This area of the city is the largest concentration of academic medical centers in pink in New York City, with some educational institutions in purple and a smattering of life science commercial companies in orange. Rockefeller, Sloan Kettering, Weill Cornell Medicine, and more are all here. And we can see the development of a commercial life science opportunity being pursued by the New York Blood Center in the center of the screen in red. And finally, we have Cornell Technion, which provides the bridge between Academic Alley in Manhattan and a major commercial live, work, play opportunity in Long Island City. Next slide. This shows you Silvercup Properties on the left, a potential commercial lab development site in thatched red, which could be the gateway for Academic Alley institutions into Long Island City, where speculative commercial developments are now being built by King Street Properties in Court Square and Alexandria. Next slide. Moving down to Midtown East, we have NYU Langone and Bellevue Hospital in pink, surrounded by NYC's largest concentration of commercial life science space in red, and projects, potential new projects in thatched red. The Alexandria Life Sciences Center is with the third tower coming online is here. Alexandria's Pfizer properties, which could be developed into life science space after the next 5 years, and 345 Park Avenue South, where Deerfield Management is developing their $635 million life sci innovation campus called The Cure. We also see the public health building and the adjoining Hunter College nursing campus, which represents another potential commercial development opportunity in this area. Next slide. Finally, we have Hudson Square, which currently represents a large concentration of commercial tech and life science users in red. Google Hudson Square, New York Genome Center, J Labs, and NYC Biolabs, two of NYC's most recent incubators, are here. And there is also a potential new life science opportunity with the Life Science Center at Pace University. Next slide. On the west side, up in the Bronx, we have Simone Healthcare Development building a mixed-use life science development called the Bronx Hutchinson Metro Center, right next to Einstein Medical School and Montefiore Medical Center. This development will connect Lower Manhattan with development happening in suburban Westchester County. Next slide. Columbia's main campus, Columbia Presbyterian, has many academic medical centers and educational institutions, but little commercial development at the moment. The Audubon Business and Technology Center is located in Washington Heights at 3960 Broadway, nearby a new Launch Labs jointly developed or created between Alexandria and Columbia. Columbia has also issued a developer RFP for a university-owned parcel of land in the area. This cluster is the most isolated from the other clusters except by water. Water taxis could connect this cluster to all other clusters in Manhattan, in less than 1/2 hour. Next slide. Manhattanville is home to Columbia's lower campus, including the Jerome Green Science Center, the New York Structural Biology Center, and CUNY Center for Discovery and Innovation. There is also a commercial life science development called Manhattanville Factory District, which consists of both ground up and refurbished buildings. Harlem Biospace, one of the city's incubators, lives in the Manhattanville Factory District, as does Valestra, a life science startup that just completed a $44 million seed funding. Next slide. In one of the fastest growing areas of the city right now, we move down to Midtown West. This cluster consists of the Hudson Research Center at 519 West 54th Street, which houses the New York Stem Cell Foundation and HyberCell, a Mount Sinai spinout, together with other medical uses. This map is slightly out of date because the largest life science lease of the year, 165,000 square feet, was just signed by Mount Sinai at 787 11th Avenue, which is right behind the Hudson Research Center in red here. MIT Media Lab professor Neri Oxman also signed a 36,000 square foot lease to house an innovative research and design facility in the same building. And finally, there's an intriguing new life science commercial development at 77 West 66th Street, recently vacated by Disney and acquired by Taconic for life science conversion. Next slide. This brings us back to Hudson Square, which is the nexus between the West Side Corridor and Jersey City. Next slide. And then over to Jersey City. Jersey City represents the other ground up potential commercial lab development site and is the gateway between the academic medical centers in Manhattan and the pharma companies in New Jersey. This is a very exciting developing subcluster where 95 Green Street is being converted by Thor Equities into a life science property. Argent Ventures is working on the Cove, and Liberty Science Center is developing Sci City here. This could ultimately become a 30-acre stretch of science and tech development right on the banks of the Hudson River. Now I'll turn the program back to Jim Holland from Triumvirate, our sponsor for this webinar.
Thank you, Nancy. That's a terrific overview of these wet lab spaces coming online in New York City. Obviously, life science is the new finance here in New York City and a place to invest. Welcome everyone again to this afternoon's discussion on wet lab requirements here in New York City. We are focused specifically on New York City today. We hope this will be an informative and engaging session, and we will be leaving time, as Nancy mentioned, at the end for discussion, for your questions and perspectives. Our agenda is broken up into 3 parts. First is the initial or setup requirements needed prior to moving into a new space. The second will be around the ongoing requirement and common issues. We'll also then on our third piece, we'll be talking about advanced requirements and operations that a lot of biotech firms are undertaking today. And lastly, we'll be wanting to create a discussion around the operational engagement between the tenant, owner, property, and facility managers. Next slide, please. To build on what Nancy would talk about, to give it to you visually, Triumvirate has been a complete 360-degree environmental health and safety management services firm, everywhere from lab services, facilities, support and engineering, chemical management and disposal, field services, and staff support. We have been operating now throughout the country for about 30 years and excited to be a sponsoring member of New York City Builds Bio and a corporate member as well. Next slide, please. Allow me to introduce our panelists today. As I mentioned, I'm Jim Holland. I manage our professional services group. We have approximately 75 consultants and staff that deliver EH&S support through biotech, whether it be in universities or hospital research clients across the US. Mike Lofuccio is also joining me as a practice director here in the New York region. He is a CIH and has been working in New York City with the regulatory agencies and understanding regulations for the last 10 years. Amy Giovini is our manager of our professional services here in New York State, in New York office, and New Jersey as well. And lastly, Alicia Aniello is our general manager overseeing all of our operations here in New York. Our Queens Astoria branch is home to 80 employees. We operate the only commercially treatment, storage, and disposal facility in the 5 boroughs, or TSDF, which is where typically we would bring your hazardous material consolidated and routed out to different locations. Next slide, please. A few opening thoughts. Moving from an incubator space, whether it's a biotech or a university or a hospital space, is a real challenge, not unlike trying to fix your airplane and flying it at the same time at 10,000 feet. Finding the right space, negotiating lease terms, doing the build out and planning the move is a lot. At some point, you're going to realize that there are a number of move-in items, some required and simply good housekeeping are needed to get started. Those requirements have typically been managed inside the incubator space that you've been working in up to date, whether it's in a hospital, a private incubator, or a university. But now you own them prior to operating your staff and team to develop your next generation of pharmaceutical. Our presentation today covers key permitting, approvals, and operational steps your firm needs to take to operate efficiently and safely and compliantly. We hope our discussion today is of interest not only to life sciences contemplating a move into their own space, but also to building owners, leasing agents, facility and property managers as well. As I mentioned, we structured this into 4 parts: the initial setup, our ongoing and routine needs, advanced needs, and that discussion around operational engagement. So let me introduce Mike Bafuccio, who will take us through the initial startup needs. Mike, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jim. So to operate a lab in New York City, what are the permits and licenses that are needed? What are the programs that need to be put in place? Really from an environmental health and safety compliance perspective. So I'm going to summarize some federal health and safety rules, some local health and safety rules, move on to some environmental rules, and then probably tie it together, how it all ties together with the physical space of the laboratory itself. So first, because the safety of the people working is always going to be paramount, I'm going to start with the overarching worker health and safety programs that need to be put into place. So laboratories are uniquely dangerous places. Unlike really most other industries, labs tend to have a huge variety of hazardous substances on site. So some may be flammable solvents, some may be explosive, some may be live biological agents, biological strains, some may be toxic if you get it on your skin. And all of this material might be in the same room, the same small room together with employees working there 8 hours a day. And that really is different than any other workplace. So how to keep employees safe? Luckily, just staring at this, no one has to start from scratch. How to keep employees safe? There is an Occupational Safety and Health Administration. OSHA, they already have a lot of specific requirements. The major ones being chemical hygiene. So these are the written plans and program details about all the chemical hazards and all lab SOPs, all the rules for chemical procurement, how you're going to generate waste, where it's going to go. That all has to be written and documented. Also, there's an emergency action plan. What if there's a chemical spill or a chemical fire? It's extremely important that all employees know what steps to take, whether to evacuate, whether to notify the appropriate personnel. But this is one of those things that can affect multiple tenants, right? If a chemical spill travels from one tenant to another, are they trained the same way? Are they going to respond to these hazards completely differently, which can lead to just a riskier situation? There's also exposure control and biological safety programs. So biological hazards and infectious agents have an entirely different set of regulations and requirements based on the BSL or the biosafety level. Respiratory protection, something that is important to all of us, especially in the past year or so, right? How are you making sure the laboratory air is free of any hazards? There are, of course, lab standards for air changes in a laboratory, how many air changes you're supposed to have. But depending on the material, depending on the work, sometimes you may need fume hoods, you might need local exhaust ventilation. In some cases, employees need to wear respirators, N95s, or even greater respirators than that to protect them. In that case, a documented respiratory protection program is required, including training, fit testing, right? Not as simple as just handing out respirators. So next slide, please. And all of this gets tied together with training. But next slide, thank you. So that is mostly federal, that's OSHA. In New York City, the fire department, the FDNY, probably plays the largest role of any city agency in keeping laboratories safe and compliant. So beyond the standard fire safety and hazardous material issues, you may think of fire extinguisher compliance, having eye washes and safety showers accessible, conducting fire drills, assigning fire marshals. The FDNY also issues actual certificates of fitness for those supervising the use of hazardous materials in a lab. The actual rule is anytime laboratory operations are ongoing, someone with this certificate needs to be there supervising the activities. The FDNY, they also issue laboratory permits in order for chemical laboratories to operate. They need a permit issued by the FDNY. Beyond that, the FDNY will obviously be interested in all other areas of the building code and electrical code as it relates to safety. This includes gas manifold systems, contained gaseous materials and cylinders, and things of that nature. So next slide, please. So, and that is just worker, day-to-day health and safety. How are you going to keep them safe? There's also a slew of environmental regulations as well. I included this picture here. If some of you have been following the news recently, you may have seen this picture. Apparently there was a pack of dogs identified outside an abandoned chemical plant in Russia. They got into some leftover chemicals. So I believe this chemical in particular was copper sulfate, which is generally an innocuous salt compared to other chemicals it could have been. But the point is, it's very easy for toxic material to escape from areas, and there's a lot of rules that prevent that from happening. So there is the Federal Environmental Protection Agency we all know of. New York State also has the Department of Environmental Conservation, and New York City on a local level has its own Department of Environmental Protection. So there's layers, federal, state, and local requirements. And really, it's mostly geared towards how to make sure none of this gets out into the environment. So some of the waste that laboratories generate may meet the definition of hazardous waste, which is actually a very specific definition of your waste material. If that's the case, it'll need to be taken off-site by a licensed hauler. There's really no exceptions to that rule. But even the staff, whether it's the tenants or the facilities, the people that are signing that, hey, this is okay to put on the road and be shipped away, there's a lot of training requirements for them just to be able to say, this material is accurately described and it's packaged appropriately for transportation. That has a lot of training requirements. Additionally, documentation and record keeping, all the permits, licenses for the end facilities, the waste haulers, all of that's needed. What if something doesn't meet this strict definition of hazardous waste? Well, that doesn't mean you don't have to worry about it. New York City has a lot of requirements, what you can put out for garbage, what can go into the sewer, what can be drain disposed. And they have certain parameters where, it might not be an EPA hazardous waste, but it still can't be dumped down the drain, right? And some facilities may even require an individual wastewater permit from the city. An actual application, they issue you a permit. Now you can discharge in our sewer system. So next slide, please. So most of what I spoke about are programs, documented plans, trainings, procedures, etc. A lot of it translates into what we think of when we think of what a lab looks like. So physical objects in the lab, first aid kits, a whole host of different types of waste containers, spill response kits, And really signage everywhere, really about everything. There's also potential waste storage rooms you might plan to have, chemical storage rooms. Often the requirements for these areas are different from the rest of the laboratory. They need different fire ratings. They need to have a water supply. There needs to be a hardwired phone nearby. Locking doors as well. It sounds simple, but I've actually seen this cause a lot of headaches. It's important that doors allow unobstructed egress out of a building in an emergency, right? No matter where you are in a building, you need to be able to get to the street level without needing a key or a lock to get there, right? But depending on the biosafety level, the doors also may need to be locked going into a laboratory. So it seems simple, but in practice, right? Is it possible someone in an office area in a lab needs to go through another lab to get to the exit door, and that lab is key card coded? So it's important to think ahead of just the overall flow of the doors, how they're set up. Does it actually make sense with what the lab operation is going to be? So there's a lot to consider just in the initial setup, right? But with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Amy Giovini, to talk about once you're already set up.
All right, thank you, Mike. Next slide, please. Perfect. So Mike spoke about what to do when company is preparing to come into a lab space. Now you are all moved in. So the transition happens from an empty space to an occupied and operating laboratory. The one thing that separates a lab from any other workspace is the type of material coming in and going out of the operation. So whether it's chemicals, biological material, or hazardous waste, lab work can be done safely and effectively with a planned approach. EHS programs need to be developed and their components should be fully implemented as part of operations. New employees need to be trained before working in the lab. Programs need to be developed for safe handling of chemicals, biological safety levels, and facility-specific practices need to be established. The components of an EHS program include standard operating procedures, training, inspections, and regular updates. So we have seen companies jump from 10 to 60 employees almost overnight. It's important to build a scalable EHS program that grows with your operations. We're sometimes asked if it's possible to delegate out EHS responsibilities. The answer is no. So whether it's OSHA, the NYC DEP, or Department of Environmental Protection, or FDNY, all regulatory agencies hold the operating company responsible for the EHS compliance of its operations. Firms like ours offer support and guidance to build EHS programs which satisfy all regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the life cycle of a chemical. Once chemicals come into the lab, they are used for a process and then they become waste. Sometimes the waste is not hazardous and it's approved to go down the drain. Often there's waste that must be collected and taken off-site for treatment and disposal. Depending on the type of waste and the amount that's generated, different regulations apply. Companies detail the type and amount of waste they expect to generate in order to determine their waste generator status. This determination directly impacts the necessary components of their hazardous material management program. So you might be asking, why do we do all of this? EHS programs keep employees safe, it keeps companies operational, and complies with regulations and standards established by OSHA, the New York DEP, and the FDNY. The Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics' most recent report showed that over 140,000 non-fatal workplace injuries and illnesses were reported among New York's private industry employers in 2019. So that's about 2.2 cases per 100 full-time workers per year. So injuries do happen and it's important to be prepared. Next slide, please. As part of that preparation, there is a strong reporting element. So agency EHS reporting is required for most companies operating in laboratory spaces. The annual reports and certification required EHS programs like injury and illness record keeping, chemical inventories, a certificate of fitness for non-production chemical labs, or a C14. There are certain nuances to these reporting elements. So for example, the illness and injury record keeping standard requirement, not only will you need to track OSHA recordable injuries, but also certain more severe injuries require a phone call directly into your OSHA, your local OSHA office within 8 to 24 hours, depending on the severity of the incident. So the responsibility is on the operating company to determine what reporting and certification requirements apply to them, and to maintain all EHS program components necessary to comply. Next slide, please. So inspections happen regularly. They can be unannounced from any applicable agency and comprehensive or really specific to a certain area or piece of equipment. They could be initiated by an employee complaint, a non-employee that interacts with your company, or even in some instances, we've seen emergency responders making that call to report the incident. So we've seen many inspections go viral over this past year and inspect spaces via video call. There's also an employee video component to ensure that EHS programs are not just documented, but also fully implemented as part of the process within laboratory operations. So I've had one company where an inspector came to site unannounced and initiated by an anonymous complaint to review the emergency egress and exit route access within that space. That company was prepared, they had an effective EHS program in place and got through the inspection without a citation. On the other hand, I've worked with a company that had pulled us in after the OSHA inspection. They had EHS binders with programs from many years ago, but did not have an active EHS program and was out of compliance on major requirements. The person that interacted with the inspector was not trained on how to handle an inspection, and the inspection scope went from one piece of equipment to a comprehensive inspection of the whole facility. They received numerous citations, at which point they pulled us in to help. So what I'm getting at here is that the best way to handle an inspection is to prevent it from happening with a strong EHS program. In addition, it's important to have individuals on site that have been trained on how to respond, EHS experts involved, and documented internal inspections, as well as follow up on findings. So now I'm going to hand this back over to Mike. He's going to speak about phase 3, or the advanced support component of a program.
Thank you, Amy. So as much as we've covered so far, if you can believe it, this is really almost just the basics for general lab operation. Depending on what is going on in the lab, additional health and safety standards may come into play. So depending on what types of biological agents are used, a whole series of biosafety requirements come into play. And these are requirements written by the National Institute of Health, the NIH. So for biosafety level 2, the second highest one, biosafety cabinet installation and maintenance is required. So that's usually the biggest part. In addition to stricter security, stricter hygiene requirements. Beyond that, as the agents get more infectious, something like Ebola, researchers may be doing research on Ebola. You may get into BSL 3 or even higher than that. At that point, generally, federal programs are triggered, such as FSAP, the Federal Select Agent Program. The CDC will start being heavily involved. You may need a CDC registration. Additionally, in New York, the state and city do have some additional provisions for rDNA research. We are planning to do a deeper dive into those during a subsequent presentation, so please stay tuned for that. But beyond that, there's also high hazard operations. For instance, if the lab has large, high-tech, energy-intensive pieces of equipment for whatever scientific research they're doing that are capable of large energy discharges, who actually maintains these? Would staff ever, open up a panel, oh, this part's busted, let me go in with a screwdriver and fix it, knowing that they know how the machine works? If so, that's fine, but regulations for control of hazardous energy come into play. And that includes lockout, tagout, that includes electrical safety, which are actually all the same standards that are applicable to general facilities maintenance, which some of you may be familiar with. chemicals in storage, maybe not as much, but chemicals in storage over time in the right conditions can lead to chemicals becoming more hazardous. So explosive, shock sensitive, if they've been able to crystallize over all this time. So how are you going to train people to identify this? What are the contingency plans if you do identify something like that? So what else, right? If the lab has a vivarium, if they start doing animal trials, there's a new host of requirements there. You need an institutional animal care and use committee at a very baseline, right? But there are also international accreditation bodies such as ALAC that has international standards for animal care used in research. Laser safety, depending on the laser that may be used, there's a whole nother set of standards in registration. Are you going to be using radioactive materials in the lab? That's another program, another reporting requirement. This time it's to NYSERDA, which is actually, it's the counterpart of the Department of Energy. So ultimately, there are a lot of EHS considerations. So I will now hand it over to my colleague Alicia to kind of talk about how to tie it all together. So thank you.
Just return this up.
Thank you, Michael. Nancy and the BioBuilds Plus team, including sponsors, really do a wonderful job of bringing such a diverse group of peers together for engaging conversation and dialogue. I'm here to close out our presentation and kind of prime the pump for our breakout discussions. The breakout discussions are my favorite parts of these. So thank you, Nancy, for putting these together on a consistent basis. On the call, whether you're a scientist, an innovator, an investor, an owner, a developer, a contract, a leasing agency, a property manager, right? And I do think that there are people that fit all these bills on the call. How do you decide what the right setup is for you? As an innovator, how are you going to choose which space is best for you? And as a property manager, how are you going to set yourself apart from the competition and attract the best tenants? Nancy had such a long list of spaces that are going to come online and different opportunities, right? So there are a lot of choices here. In years past in New York, right, their innovation mainly started in our research hospitals and universities. In these scenarios, scientists truly had white glove service, right? All aspects of training, waste management, reporting, all those other compliance items that Mike and Amy discussed really had to be handled by the institutions that these people were housed in because that name brand was there. So if you were a researcher at Mount Sinai is taking care of all of this because Mount Sinai understands if there's a compliance issue, it's coming back to Mount Sinai and the Mount Sinai name. Now with incubator spaces and research centers that are standalone, researchers and property managers can get creative, right? They have the freedom of choice on how they're going to handle these safety and compliance matters. Whoever came up with the quote, I don't know, but with great freedom also comes great responsibility. So this is kind of the space that Triumvirate's most interested in discussing with this group, right? What's the best approach for health, safety, and compliance concerns in the eyes of the innovators and scientists, and which approach proves to minimize the reputational risk for property owners and managers? So with this quick graphic that's up now, I'd like to introduce the idea of centralized versus decentralized approaches, right, to different arenas. We've seen this before. If anybody's following Bitcoin, that's a very decentralized approach to banking and kind of money exchanges. The example that I'd like to use here is just a bit simpler than that and something that I think everybody on the call understands, right? Simon Malls and Tanger outlets versus Etsy and Amazon. So the example on the left is a very known quantity. A set number of contracts are held between Simon and their vendors and retailers. As a shopper and as a retailer, you could expect the same level of service each time, no matter what city you're in, no matter what town you're in. The experience will be the same. And it's well practiced, it's well rehearsed, the logistics are rote, you know? So in my mind, the only risk here really is kind of boredom, right? It's kind of vanilla, it's the same every time. My father says, no matter where you go, there you are, right? Every American town has these things and they all look the same, right? And so there's pluses and minuses to that. The example on the right breaks out of that kind of box store mentality because the boxes are now coming into your house instead, right? So you have this freedom of choice. I have thousands of vendors that I can choose from if I'm on Etsy or Amazon. But with that, there's now more FedEx, UPS, and Amazon drivers and trucks on the road than ever before because the consumer and seller are doing business directly and there's millions of transactions a day. With this freedom of choice, we've recognized quality and quantity control issues on both sides, right? So kind of a nasty article that's been coming up lately is about kind of cheap children's toys being purchased from manufacturers in countries that don't have the same regulations as we do in the US. And we're back to having lead paint in children's toys, something that we hope to have ended years ago. Can we go to the next slide, please? So let's bring this back into the perspective of environmental health and safety and all the new standalone life science centers that Nancy talked about at the top of the presentation. Again, what we found through the years in New York City is that researchers and innovators have been graduating from these white glove service locations if they're coming from hospitals and universities. What I personally witnessed last year is that there are investors and other groups recognizing the importance and the opportunities ahead of us with life science hubs in New York. And while they're eager to jump in on the action, they likely, maybe not likely, but a majority in what I saw last year had not had any experience in this arena before with chemicals and safety. So, so this may sound obvious, but treating researchers like tenants of a regular office building, we don't really recommend that, right? For all the reasons that Mike and Amy listed earlier. And we brought this presentation to you today in order to help bring awareness to the responsibility and the burden of environmental health and safety on an organization, whether that organization is a budding company or a property developer, right? I don't think this is news to anyone on the call, but the state of the art laboratory spaces that are being built or retrofitted are much more sophisticated than office spaces with cubicles and therefore need more sophisticated infrastructure in order to mitigate risk, both health and safety risk and reputational risk. And the reputational risk is like, I'm really speaking to the property owners and developers at this point, right? Legally, right, everybody's going to be putting these, very watertight lease agreements together. So there's no onus placed on the leasing agency or the property owner or manager in case of a fire, a spill, or God forbid, an injury, right? But honestly, even if one of those things happen, even if legally you're covered and you don't need to financially have any burden placed on you, when the news hits the papers, right? The building's name, the address, they're there, right? And that's it, right? It's an unsafe building now, right? So how are you gonna attract tenants then? So for all this, so on this slide, right? For all the services listed on the left, it's very typical for those services to be wrapped into a lease agreement, right? But what is the desired approach for the items on the right? And these are a lot of the things that Mike and Amy talked about. In that Simon versus Amazon example, logistically, it's a nightmare, right? Contractor management is a huge piece of the puzzle, or maybe a bigger piece of the puzzle than you've thought of previously. I'll give you an example without too many details, right? Solid waste management in New York City. The city is putting together a concerted effort to minimize the number of commercial solid waste vendors that are servicing any one area. I don't know who's read about this, but the city broke the map of the city into 19 different zones, and there's a couple of only 3 solid waste vendors are going to be awarded each zone, because what they're trying to do is minimize the number of solid waste contractors servicing any of these regions, right? So think about it. If you have 10 tenants and they each have a different hazardous waste or regulated medical waste hauler, how much space do you have in your loading dock, right? How many people are you going to have coming and going out of this building? Emergencies are huge. And I'll use this as an example, just because Mike used this example earlier about emergencies. If there's a spill that migrates from one tenant to another, which emergency response contractor gets called? Is it the one that was hired by tenant A who started the spill? Or does tenant A and tenant B both call their own emergency response contractors? What have the tenants in both cases been taught? Do we evacuate the building? Do we evacuate in place? What's the rally point? Who notifies the rest of the tenants in the building? Do we expect to leave all the emergency response protocols and preparedness and training on the shoulders of the individual researchers and tenants that are really just trying to do their research and their work? If you can remember Jim's photo of the airplane being worked on while in flight, this is truly the experience of these innovators. And I just don't know if we want to burden them further. Next slide, please. So you heard Amy and Mike list off all the areas of concern, the written procedures, the reporting, the training. The truth is, a true environmental health and safety program is a collection of anywhere from 30 to 40 separate programs, which all need constant upkeep and training. For over 30 years, Triumvirate has continuously improved the way we do business with and for our clients. We are the premier environmental services firm in New England and the Cambridge area specifically. We now also have a national presence thanks to and at the request of our long-term partners and clients. Just in time for New York City to come online with all these new spaces, we've branded a total package to ensure the success of life science in New York City. We do need to attract top talent in New York City in order for us to rebound after what was a tough year last year in so many ways. Triumvirate's EHS1 program is a one-of-a-kind, one-stop shopping experience for all environmental health, safety, and regulatory compliance needs, including on-site support of chemical inventory and management, hazardous waste disposal, and regulated medical waste recycling. Yes, I said recycling. Happy Earth Day next week. We're the only ones that recycle medical waste. Triumvirate can manage any and all facets of environmental health and safety from inception to implementation and management. That is it for the Triumvirate plug. And I don't expect that we talk about Triumvirate in our breakout sessions, but instead I hope that we discuss, what the desire is for EHS involvement from an overarching approach. Will it be provided by the space, or will we continue to leave the onus on the researchers and the tenants? Thank you, everyone, for listening in, and thank you again, Nancy, for having us. I'm going to bring it back to Nancy for any Q&A and the breakout sessions.
Nancy, you're muted.
Thank you, everyone. That was a really informative presentation. I know that all of our participants in this webinar learned a lot from what you were saying. And I would encourage any of you with questions to please put them in the chat box. As you were talking, I was thinking, Jim, maybe this is a question for you. You have such deep experience in Cambridge and the surrounding municipalities in Massachusetts. And I'm just wondering if you could, it all sounds very complicated, but give a little history of how this actually evolved in the Cambridge, Boston area to the point where they became so proficient in managing and regulating these types of uses.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, it's an interesting story. There are people who can tell it better than I, but the fact is that back in the 50s and early 60s, Cambridge was very much a working class town. Other than Harvard and Cambridge, it wasn't what we think of today. When some of these small startups were spinning out of those two respective universities, they would go to the town board and say, we'd like to set up a lab and do this and do that. And there was a huge negative reaction by the community. There was this perception, even before the internet, that they were building dangerous drugs or germs that were going to get out of the lab. So Cambridge was very proactive and started underneath their Department of Health, a biosafety committee that permitted all the uses and operations throughout the town of Cambridge, and that has spilled over into places like Watertown and other towns and municipalities throughout Massachusetts. But what that did was give the citizenry and the local, the community members strong confidence that what was being done there was not creating this super Frankenstein virus that was going to take over the world. And that then led into, a certain amount of creation of certainty that people could set up buildings or operate, knew how to design to it, a standard, knew what was expected of them, and so they could accelerate. And that's why Cambridge has probably, had some partially due to some of its success. Obviously, two academic powerhouses like MIT and Harvard will generate that. We see that we operate obviously in San Francisco and in LA and Raleigh-Durham and here in New York and New Haven. We're seeing that it's usually a large university or institution and oftentimes in conjunction with a hospital that will drive this kind of thing. So what we're obviously what you've described is happening in New York is what happened in Cambridge probably about 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, and it's really important, for the neighborhoods in New York to understand that these kinds of procedures are in place to protect them and make them comfortable with this kind of a use, especially since life science is growing so rapidly, and we would really like to see New York become a leading cluster, help lead us out of the pandemic. All of this kind of transparency and procedures and regulatory structure for protection will be important going forward. And so when there is a life science development, let's say there's a developer or property owner thinking about conversion to life science use or a ground up development, at what point in the process do you get involved? And what do you do? How do you help them?
So obviously, as they start to move in tenants, it's more of the comfort level for both the tenants as well as the property owner and facility manager. That obviously everything is in compliance. Mike mentioned the doors. I can't tell you the number of times we've run into doors that weren't fire rated at a new facility. Primarily because it was originally built as a traditional office building and was being converted. So, and we've had previous discussions around the challenges of finding space for ventilation and electrical. And I think some of the construction people and architects can speak to that better. But what we typically find is as they're starting to get these properties ready for move-in with tenants is when they're discovering that laundry list of items I mentioned that we covered today. Is this going to work for people? Do we have egress? Do we have, the doorways? Do we, with the doorways? Do we have fire prevention systems? Do we have adequate ventilation? The biosafety labs and the RD&A permit, which we mentioned, we'll talk about at another event, is going to be, it drives a lot of that. And, the access and this, that, and the other thing. So, just getting chemicals in and out of the building, chemicals in, waste products out can be a challenge. And as Alicia alluded to, you don't want 5 different hazardous waste vendors and 15 different, compressed gas or chemical suppliers trying to show up and load at your loading dock. I think the facility manager, property manager, building owner are going to have to step in and kind of think through how they want to operate that such that all their tenants can continue to do their research, but not create a traffic jam every morning between 8 and 9 or 8 and 4 in the afternoon trying to get supplies in and out of the building.
Yeah.
And Jim, on that too, if I could add, just like from a financial perspective, right? There's a lot of buying power, right? If you have the entire building purchasing from the same contractor off the same contract, as opposed to having 12 separate contracts for the same building, right? Even if it is with the same supplier, whether it be exactly that for supplies, cylinders, or, moving forward to disposal and things like that, right? There's a lot of buying power when you are purchasing as a group, as opposed to individual companies.
So we've got a few questions in the chat box, so I want to make sure that we get to them. What are the life science development lessons learned in Boston that can be adopted by New York City?
Thank you. Well, obviously, we touched on one of them, that there was a strong board of health, community board, town board that was involved in the managing requirements, operating requirements going forward, that kept the citizenry comfortable and knowing that the right things were happening. I think that, again, we think that there's a lot to be said about that balancing act between individual tenants and the building owners that are, and that is a debate that's still going on inside of Cambridge, as some of these tenants, you know, they're no longer a half a floor, they're an entire building. So obviously that changes, that gets muddy, or that separator gets muddy. What I think the lesson learned is, it's amazing to us how fast, and Alicia mentioned it, or Amy mentioned this, that someone will go to a 10-person research to almost 200 or 300 people within 6 months, because their molecule has efficacy. They're trying to ramp up not only, you know, their research, but then, you know, pilot plant manufacturing for clinical trials, and then, you know, examining rooms, vivarium, you know, all the specialties or advanced things that Mike talked about, BSL levels. I think we have a client that's looking at coronavirus, and, you know, they're probably going to require a higher level of BSL than they typically have installed. And so to retrofit that has been something that we're working on. I think the biggest challenge is that it's amazing to me how quickly, we've seen how fast these companies have grown. They've expanded, they've had to find new space, or they've taken over more space within an existing building. So I think that is probably the exciting part, that probably in 2 years, we're going to say that, boy, we built all this life science space, but it's not nearly enough for what we're looking for here in New York, right?
Right.
Mike, Amy, anything else you'd like to add? Alicia?
I would say, and this isn't necessarily a lesson learned yet, this may be more into looking forward, but a large part of permitting in Cambridge has to do with the Department of Health and getting community buy-in, and saying, you know, if we're going to do a specific type of rDNA research, you actually need to present to the community, and the Department of Health is involved. So far in the city, we have not seen as much DOH involvement or community involvement. My gut sense tells me that is going to change quickly. Obviously, it's very much in the public perception, infectious diseases now, right? And how they spread, where they come from, how do we do research on them? So I do believe looking forward, New York might kind of match up with Cambridge in having the Department of Health and the community more involved.
So is there an expectation that the regulatory approach will become more challenging now that there's a new EPA focus in the government with the Biden administration?
I think we can expect that. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
No, ultimately, yes. Any really any enforcement that has to do with worker health and safety, OSHA, EPA, absolutely. We're already expecting to see more enforcement of all these issues. Again, you know, the New York State DEC, or potentially the city, you know, they still have the same general administration and outlook. However, yeah, the federal government may get more involved. We're already seeing they're already putting draft infectious disease standards out, you know, a whole nother set of OSHA regulations specifically focused on infection diseases in the workplace, right? When that have been great 10 years ago. So that's already something we're working on. So as time goes on, there's going to be more enforcement. We definitely anticipate that.
To build on that, I think there's a fair amount of you know, those companies in the life science industry typically over deliver on environmental health and safety, whether they do it in-house or they use firms like ourselves. They're really trying to, they see that as a differentiator to attract employees, quite frankly. And so this is such a small part of their operating budget compared to, say, a metal bender or machine shop, where they feel like the rules are onerous. People in life science usually typically embrace these and want to do the best they can, because they know their employees are their only asset in some respects. And that's why they have to keep it safe.
Yeah. Well, obviously a lot to this field. So to all the property owners and developers out there, and the lab managers, be sure to call Triumvirate, be early to be prepared. Great. Well, that was a wonderful discussion. We're kind of at, well, wait a minute. We've got one more. So, Mitch, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Jim, by the way, and team, thank you. Great job. You've talked about each of the research entities, the tenants in the buildings have an environmental health and safety responsibility. What should the landlord's role be? And should they have a responsibility to sort of set up what they would consider minimum standards that all the tenants must adhere to and provide, I'll be delicate, oversight?
I'm gonna ask Alicia, that's her favorite topic.
Sure. And I guess the answer is that's what we wanted to really discuss on these breakouts, right? There could be, I think that's a nice answer, Mitch, that, there's a minimum standard or a minimum requirement. I do think that the landlord should have some involvement so that they understand what's going on in the building, right? Because when the fire department shows up, when the DEP shows up, right, for just a regular inspection, you got to know what's going on, right? Because they're going to show up, they're going to talk to the guy at the front desk and say, let's use right to know reporting as an example, right? Community right to know is something specific, reporting specific to New York City, where you have to list the chemicals that are in use in your laboratory spaces. So you're supposed to submit this to the DEP. The DEP then shows up and says, show me where this bottle of whatever it is, amyl nitrate is. And so being prepared for those inspections, as Amy talked about, right, is really important. And you need to do that from the very, wherever the inspector is going to walk in. The inspector could walk in at the loading dock, can walk in at the front door, right, by security. If the security guard shrugs his or her shoulders, right, it's already not a good look. Then in the case of an emergency, again, right, you're going to want those answers, right? To know when the fire department says to you, hey, building owner, or hey, security guard, what's in that laboratory? Should we go in there with hoses, or is there material in there that's water reactive? Somebody needs to produce an answer for that. And you really cannot rely simply on a PI that might not even be in the country, right? When this goes down. Security is huge, right? Will you allow in your building for people to work alone in their laboratory spaces, or will you require that there always be some kind of a buddy system? So again, God forbid there's an emergency in a laboratory, there's somebody that can call 911 because somebody else has been injured, has spilled something on themselves, right? So it's kind of a loaded question. It's a heavy question, and that's why as part of my piece, I said, is it, we cannot expect to treat these tenants like it's just another office space, where you just say, yeah, you're gonna lease this space for 3 years, great. Just make sure it's in the same condition when you turn it back over. Right? What does that mean? And what's going to be going on in those 3 years? You think about, Mike, with the lasers, the vivariums, right? You need to know what's going on in those labs. So we've seen various approaches, right? Where the tenants are kind of free to, handle EH&S as they'd like, but the building owner calls on us to do annual or biannual audits, right? Semi-annual audits, right? So where we're going in and saying, yes, hey, tenants A through D are awesome. Tenants E through J need some help, or you're going to get yourself into hot water, I really do mean it, that we all, right, everybody on this call needs the success of this to come to fruition, right? Not just for our own personal needs, but to revitalize the city. And so how are we going to attract people, right? And if it is kind of this very transactional, sure, go into the space, and like I said, God forbid something happens and you end up in the news, nobody's going back to that building. You know what I'm saying? Like it's going to be harder and harder to get tenants if your building is in the news. So that's what a good EH&S program does. Effectively, the reward is nothing happens, right? Nothing happens when an inspector shows up and no emergencies happen. So it's kind of, I don't know, an anticlimactic industry, but That's what
This is
happens
good
when
news.
everything's going well. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Thank you.
Well, on
Thank
that
you, Mitch.
note, I'm going to, Jim, did you have something else you wanted to say?
No, I just said thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so on that note, I'm going to ask Carolina to place us into our discussion rooms so everyone can meet each other and talk about, continue the conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.